folks are kind of figuring out like what we're fighting. So at its core, it's really community versus corporation.
Welcome to the 383rd installment of Ear to the Ground, the Land Stewardship Project's podcast on family farming, regenerative agriculture, community food systems, and local democracy. I'm Brian DeVore, editor of the Land Stewardship Letter. Plenty has been written about the negative impacts that result when small and medium-sized diversified farms are pushed out of a community by a corporate-controlled, industrialized form of agriculture. What sets the book Dodge County Incorporated apart is that the author, Sonia Traum-Ayers, deftly weaves the big picture trends that have, for example, caused us to lose 70% of this country's hog farmers since 1990 with her own story. How her family's 760-acre farm in southeastern Minnesota's Dodge County was, over the years, literally surrounded by a dozen concentrated animal feeding operations, resulting in a stench so powerful that at times it was difficult for the Traum family to do field work without being sickened. It's particularly troubling to read such descriptions after the author describes how her father, Lowell, created the handmade Traum operation piece by piece. With its good conservation practices and contributions to the community, it's the kind of farm we should be doing everything possible to support. The book delivers on its subtitle, Big Ag and the Undoing of Rural America. Sonia is an attorney, and she convincingly makes the case that the takeover of communities like hers was no accident. It was a methodical, concerted effort on the part of Wall Street, meat packers, and commodity groups to foist one way of producing livestock on the country, no matter the consequences. At the core of this tragedy is the role the corporate state, as Sonia calls it, plays in wrecking rural communities. And it's all legal, with the farmers who are raising the hogs themselves under this system often victimized as much as their neighbors. Should we be surprised that a business model that's more beholden to shareholders than to the communities it's extracting resources from puts profits over people? Since it was published about a year ago, Dodge County Incorporated has hit a nerve and spawned lots of discussion in rural communities about the impacts that have resulted from the corporate capture of agriculture. In fact, on November 4th, 2025, in Lanesboro, Minnesota, LSP will feature Sonia as part of a panel discussion on agricultural consolidation. Also participating in the Big Ag, Big Problems panel will be Austin Frerick, the author of Barons, Money, Power, and the Corruption of America's Food Industry. It should make for an evening of very interesting community discussion. In the run-up to this panel discussion, we're doing a two-part podcast. This episode features my conversation with Sonia. In the next episode, we'll talk to Austin about his insights into the corporate takeover of our food and farm system and what we can do about it. Sonia started our interview describing the history of her family's farm and when she started noticing the intrusion of a type of agriculture that was not good for the land, people, or communities.
My great-grandfather emigrated to the United States in 1892. His name was Ed Troyum. In the United States, it's Ed Traum. And then his son, Elmer, who was my grandfather, moved onto this farm, our farm, in 1925. So Elmer and Marie, my grandparents, moved onto the farm in 25. So the farm's been in our family for 100 years. And my dad was one of 10 children. And he was actually born on the farm in 1929. And my understanding is all 10 children, with the exception of 2, were actually born on the farm. And my father eventually purchased the farm from my grandparents. That's the farm where I was raised.
It's the classic kind of farm where it sounds like it was fairly diverse cropping, that operation. It's in southeast Minnesota there. Can you describe a little bit when you started noticing a significant change, kind of, I guess, industrialization of your area a little bit, and kind of what, over the years, it seemed to really spin out of control. It was like a kind of a feedback loop, almost the way things went with the CAFO system coming in.
I actually asked my father that question. My dad passed away at age 90 in 2019, and we talked about the first CAFO that went into the immediate area. That was 1993. A Farm Bureau farmer installed the first factory farm, swine factory farm, 1 mile directly north of our farm. And no one really understood the significance of what was occurring. In fact, my dad said at the time, like, hey, maybe that's a good idea. But no one understood the structure, how this was going to fundamentally change farming. And there was a 5-year window from 1993 to 1998, when there was just a complete ramp-up of these facilities.
Yeah, and one of the things I think you describe really well in your book is this kind of what was also different about this system than maybe what people were used to in farming was the use of the integrator system and the contracting system. I've read a lot about that and I've heard people talk about that, but I think your book does a really good job of kind of illustrating kind of to folks who aren't familiar with that system, how it is different. Can you describe a little bit about that system?
I think what's important for listeners to understand is that during that ramp-up period, 93 to 98, and I use my sister Shelley and her husband Dave as an example. Dave and Shelley farmed outside our hometown of Blooming Prairie. They were independent farmers. They were independent hog farmers, and they owned their own hogs. And so Dave would contact Hormel or some other meat packer to check prices. They had a free market in those days. But what Dave noticed, and Dave and his dad both shared this with me, when they would drive or take their pigs to Hormel, which is just 15 miles south of my hometown, the independents like Dave and his dad were forced to wait 45 minutes to an hour because they were slowly being denied access to the marketplace. They watched and they witnessed as the big semi-loads of pigs that were coming in from these area factory farms were given priority. And guys like Dave and his dad had to wait and wait and wait to deliver their hogs.
I think that's a super good point because it's easy to vilify the individual farmers who are caught up in this system. But your book makes the point, and I've heard this before, they're victims of this system as well. It's the system that has been foisted upon agriculture in rural communities, but they're kind of victims as well. They have no choice.
Absolutely. And Dave and Shelley were victims of this system. So there's been corporate capture. And 1998, Dave and Shelley were no longer able to get financing. And this is what happened. They were cut off. Farmers live and operate with an operating loan. Well, when you can't get your operating loan renewed, it's a problem. And so they were faced with, this old saying, get big or get out. Right. And so Dave and Shelley, they could get access to big money to build a big factory farm, but they couldn't remain as independents. And so they made the painful decision to get out of farming altogether.
So my understanding is you ended up with 12 CAFOs surrounding your operation, your family's farm. Describe the impact of that. I mean, for one thing, the first thing I would think of is the smell must have been incredible, but there was other impacts that you guys started noticing as it became not just, one or two neighbors who were raising hogs, but you were in the middle of a factory system.
Part of the problem was we were outsiders. There was no communication with those farmers who were part of this system, so we had no idea, quite honestly, how it worked. But you could see parts of it. And so actually the way that I discovered how this worked, I get decisions of the Minnesota Supreme Court, the Minnesota Court of Appeals that roll across my desk. And one day I received a notice to decision of the Minnesota Court of Appeals. And I thought, oh my God, I recognize those names. And so I beelined it over to the Minnesota Supreme Court, the law library, to get a copy of the trial transcript from a proceeding. It was like plugging in a Christmas tree. So 1,000-page transcript, and it detailed how this system worked. It's a pyramid scheme, and at the top you have the multinationals. In the middle you have integrators, who are local companies. I can give you more details. And they own the hogs, they own the supply chain, and then they provide feed and veterinary services to the contract growers at the bottom, what we used to call farmers. So for me, it helped me understand this system that had slowly surrounded our farm, that it was slow, methodical, intentional. And so now I understand, like I can pick out the gestational facilities, the nurseries, all these feeder operations. And now I understand the impacts, the environmental impacts, also just the cultural impacts of having this heavy weight of this corporate system that surrounds our farm.
Yeah, so what were some of the impacts you folks were seeing as far as the environmental impacts right in your neighborhood? I mean, my understanding is it made it difficult to do field work, that kind of thing?
Absolutely. It interferes with our own operation of the farm. I include a chapter in the book called The 3-Day Stink Out. I was on the combine that weekend with my dad in the fall of 2017. We were trying to pick the last 100 acres or so of our corn. The area factory farm operators were spreading manure all around us. And I can't help but think that it was intentional. I mean, the stench was unbearable. In fact, my father had to step off the combine to vomit. That's how bad it was.
Besides kind of those impacts, I think to me, and the impacts kind of on the wider community and in family farming in general, for me, the most, I guess, striking and the most heartbreaking part of your book is you describe a little bit, and you alluded to this a little bit, the impact on kind of the way people related to each other in the community. And like the example you use of your father, Lowell, who was very connected to the local church there, the family's connection to it went way back, kind of being given the cold shoulder, things like that. I think that that's a really good example of how these systems, when they're brought in, they really disrupt the community and turn people against each other.
Absolutely. There's such divisiveness in these communities. My parents initiated their first of 3 lawsuits in 2014. That year, I went to church several times with my dad because my mother had just gone into the nursing home. I knew he was getting the cold shoulder. But one Sunday after church, a senior member of the congregation came up to me, and I'll never forget it. He said, "Thank you. Thank you for your work on behalf of your family and on behalf of our community." I will never forget those words, and they power me yet today. That's over 10 years ago. But this is what's happened in rural America. Big Ag has cleverly turned neighbor against neighbor. You can't have any communication. My family has faced tremendous harassment, intimidation. It's heartbreaking.
So let's take a wider view here. I think another very important part of your book is, and it's a theme that runs throughout the book, is talking about what you kind of describe as the corporate state and how this is not by accident, for one thing. It's often argued by Big Ag and their supporters, well, this is just the invisible hand of economics, and then they've been able to convince local government, townships and counties and the state and on the federal level, this is just the way it is, so it's just inevitable. It's not inevitable. Your book is able to show, and we've seen other examples of, this is not by accident. It was a very concerted effort to squeeze farmers out, and your story is just one microcosm of that story. But talk about this idea of what you mean by the corporate state, and then describe how it does inundate everything all the way down to the township level, then down to the farm level a little bit.
Actually, a few weeks ago, I received a publication from a local journalist, and that publication is called The Loss of Our Family Farms. This publication shows the long-standing corporate planning. They created a Committee on Economic Development. I refer to it as the Committee on Corporate Development. And there was an intentional, very strategic plan to force farmers off the land. And frankly, one of the most, and this started in the 60s, 70s, and I look back and I think about the fact that not a single farmer served on this committee. Right. It was corporate bigwigs, including companies that we're very familiar with here in Minnesota. Cargill, Hormel, Pillsbury, which is now General Mills. They were doing the corporate strategic planning, and part of that was to purposely force farmers off the land. And if I may, one of the most troubling comments in this report was made by an economist who says the only way I know to get toothpaste out of a tube is to squeeze, and the only way to get people out of agriculture is likewise to squeeze agriculture. This is from a publication that was first published in 1979. Then a few years later, you have a Farm Bureau publication called When an Activist Group Comes to Town. And in that publication, this is Farm Bureau telling their farmers to run for public office, county board seats, township, and so forth, to promote modern agriculture, which is code for corporate agriculture. And so they were not there to promote our democracy, but to promote corporate agriculture.
And I think one of the things that we should, I think of this old saying, people say, a mad dog bites, and so you shouldn't be surprised when it bites you. Corporations by design are not set up to benefit the local community. They're set up to benefit shareholders who could live anywhere. And so it's not like, well, the corporate system is evil in itself. It's just that's the kind of setup it has. So we shouldn't be surprised that when it controls farming in a community that we see these negative impacts. It's not beholden to the local folks. And I think you really describe in the book how that corporate system, I think one of the examples that a lot of people would take a lot of people by surprise. We, Minnesota, are very proud of the fact that we have local control, that we have local townships can control where development goes in their community and kind of control the future of that township, and it's local folks that sit on those boards. But when you have a corporate system that's kind of inundated everything and is showing up at these meetings and bringing in outsiders to kind of say that this is the inevitable hand of the economics taking place here, and so you need to support this no matter what, it kind of undermines even local control. And one of the examples you used was kind of some of the members of the board being bribed with manure allotments. I think that's, some people would be surprised, like, wow, that's something, you never think of manure as a commodity that's exchanged, but can you describe that a little bit, and how I think that's a good example of even a really good system, which is local control, being kind of undermined there?
So I discovered in this process, I've been like a dog with a bone, but I was determined, like, I'm going to figure this out. And after my parents brought their first lawsuit, I eventually discovered that 3 of the township officers signed manure easements at the same time that the county was, that they were moving forward, the industry was moving forward to obtain a conditional use permit to install yet another swine factory farm 1/2 mile directly west of our farm. So that manure easement allows the factory farm operator or the manure hauler to enter your land and to spread manure. Well, the swine operators, the hog operators, contract growers are told that manure is valuable. It is their responsibility to get rid of the manure. And as my dad used to say, they got to get rid of the damn stuff. And so one of the ways you do that is you sign manure easements, because these are such huge operations. There isn't sufficient land, and so they're looking to spread the manure on other land in the immediate area. So if manure is valuable, and if that contract grower is paid for the manure, that's another source of revenue. In this instance, these were 10-year easements. So I questioned, I went to the township meeting, and I sat about 6 feet away from the township officers. These are folks I know, grew up with them. And I kept hitting them with the same question: how much did you pay? How much did you pay? They wouldn't answer. Finally, one of them said, we paid for the trucking.
So to put that in context, the reason this is so important is with the CAFO system, in the more traditional farming system and in a regenerative farming system, manure is a source of fertility. And the ideal situation is you kind of have a closed loop system where the livestock are producing the manure, it's getting out there on the land, it's being used to feed the crops in the pasture and that type of thing. And then it's just this closed system kind of thing. With these CAFOs, they produce so much liquid manure that it's often becomes a waste product to be getting rid of. And we see that with the permitting system, where you're supposed to, through your permit, show that you have so much land to apply that manure to. There's some fudging that goes along with that because it is a waste, instead of something that like a farm is using to feed their crops and kind of in that closed loop system, they're trying to find any place they can to spread that manure and get rid of it. And it's really a shame because it is a really valuable source of fertility, and now it's become this waste product. So it's not a surprise it becomes this thing that's traded kind of as a way to kind of curry favor in a local township, that kind of thing. And they're desperate. They'll do anything to get that spread on these farms. And yeah, so I think that's it's another example of this is a different kind of farming than anything we've ever seen before. So I wanted to switch gears a little bit and talk about, since your book has come out, and one of the things that I don't want to put words in your mouth, but reading this book, I got a sense that you, when you started writing this book as a way to tell your family's own story. But as you were doing the research and talking to folks, you realize obviously this is a much bigger issue that affects a lot of people, and you were able to connect with a lot of people, a lot of organizations, and other people who were struggling with this same challenge of these CAFOs coming into the area and kind of the corporate system taking over in rural areas. Can you talk a little bit about that transformation a little bit? I feel like you really realized, okay, we're not alone. We're not the only ones struggling with this. And that can be, I think, a positive piece because you realize, yeah, we're not alone and we don't have to do this fight by ourselves.
That's what was eye-opening to me. And one of the reasons I actually started connecting with other groups almost 10 years ago was because of the harassment. Almost the minute that my parents initiated their first lawsuit, garbage in our road ditches, garbage in our driveway, telephone calls to my father at 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. He's in his mid-80s and he's getting phone calls. Lowell, have you changed yet? This is what was happening. I started to connect with folks that I knew in Iowa, Wisconsin, Illinois, other places, and asked them, what are you witnessing? And what I discovered was that the same exact tactics that were used against my family were common tactics that were used across the board. We were not alone. So that was extremely helpful to understand that. And the harassment, intimidation continued for years and years and years. And, now we're finally seeing that on a national level. But I think what the book has done, I will tell you, personally for me, I'm an attorney, I'm a family law attorney, so I take people through the painful process of divorce, and I always tell my clients to journal, and I tell them we may use it, we may never use it, but it's part of the healing process. And so for me personally, I took my own advice, and I started writing the book and putting it down, and I started interviewing my father like I knew, he's 85, I knew that his days were numbered, and that it was important to tell this story. And it's been very healing, but more so, and it's not about promoting the book, but it's about educating others and helping others understand the significance of what's been happening in rural America. And I think that's really the point of this book, is that it's opened eyes, it's helped others see that the corporate takeover has been very intentional, very methodical, very strategic, and it's helped others kind of put together the pieces. And I can't tell you the dozens and dozens of people who've reached out to me like, oh my God, I get it.
Yeah, and you've done dozens of book events, and it sounds like this happens a lot with events like this. People come up and share their own story, and they feel so appreciative because they always thought they were alone. So I think that's a super important role that this book plays.
As to that point, I told my publisher as we were getting ready to publish, I told him, what's going to happen. I said, I'm going to be contacted because this is not just my story or our story. I said, this is the story of rural America. And it is exactly what has happened, that people have come up to me and gone, oh my God, in tears. I had a woman recently at an event, and she came up to me and she was crying because it speaks to so many others. They understand why their farm has disappeared and why their family was pushed off the land. And so we need to gather those stories and tell the story of rural America.
So, what gives you hope? I mean, the hearing these stories is great, and it's great that you're drawing attention to this issue. And groups like Land Stewardship Project are working on this issue, and some other great organizations out there. But what gives you hope, or is it inevitable? Has the feedback loop gotten too much of a feedback loop, and we're just going to spin down to the bottom here? But does anything give you hope?
I think we all have to have hope. You know, that's a word actually I always tell my clients. I tell them, I'm going to give you one word. It's not a legal term, but it's a word that you need to take you through this process. And it's the same thing here, and that word is hope. And so what gives me hope? Folks are kind of figuring out like what we're fighting, and at its core, we're fighting kind of this corporatism. And what's really quite interesting is Western Wisconsin, for example, these folks, it's a bipartisan group in Western Wisconsin. These folks are getting together. They're fighting together as Democrats and Republicans. It's a bipartisan group, and they're fighting together and putting in place local ordinances to prohibit large corporate agriculture from coming into their communities. And so at its core, it's really community versus corporation. That's
a really good point. You know, LSP's had a couple of meetings just in the past couple months in rural communities where farmers have showed up to talk about the impacts of consolidation and the monopolization of their industry on both ends of it, both limiting their access to markets, to fair markets, as well as them paying inflated prices for inputs, even restricting their ability to repair their own equipment, that type of thing. And they're pretty angry about it. And it is a bipartisan issue. We're seeing folks show up. We've had Attorney General Keith Ellison, the Attorney General here in Minnesota, show up to these meetings, and people are sharing stories with him. He's made it clear that there are laws out there that are being violated, and we just need evidence and that gives people hope, I think. And it also, again, these people are showing up and realizing I'm not the only one being affected, and I think that's a really powerful piece. And again, it's another example of, in this corporate state that's dominating agriculture right now, they are victims as well. And it's a place where maybe they can come together with non-farmers, consumers, environmentalists, just folks who are worried about the future of the local township, and kind of find common ground a little bit, and a common enemy. And the common enemy is this consolidation machine that's just, it's unprecedented. It's just really spinning out of control and going to leave us in a situation where we're going to have about one farmer per county if things go the way they are. And the other thing is, we've seen through our Farm Gains program, huge interest in farming. Our classes fill up every year. That is not a problem. There is an interest among young people. That is a myth that they aren't interested. However, they get through the class, they get all this great programming through that. They hit that brick wall of land access, getting access to markets. And until we fix that consolidation problem, we are kind of just training folks to do things that they are not going to be able to use their skills for, from what we can see.
Absolutely, and that's the problem with this pyramid scheme that's been created by the big multinationals. Farmers cannot get access to the marketplace. If I were a hog farmer in southern Minnesota, you can't show up at Hormel, JBS, or cross the border over in Sioux Falls and go to Smithfield. You can't deliver a load of hogs. You have to be part of the system. And so it's part of corporate capture, and these contract growers they're part of corporate capture. They can't get out.
Yeah, so Sonia, the books have been out just a little less than a year. This fall it'll be a full year, and you've really been getting out there and have gotten a fair amount of publicity and have generated some news coverage. And I know you've just spoken to a lot of people, both through your events and over the phone. But what's been the reaction to the book?
I think the book has opened a discussion. Unfortunately, folks in rural communities are afraid. They're afraid to speak out because over the years, jobs have been threatened, small businesses have been threatened, and so they've been forced into silence. And I'm finding that in my home community, this has opened a discussion, and perhaps not just there, but in the state of Minnesota and across the Midwest. People are no longer afraid to have these discussions, and that's critical. And one of the reasons I spoke out also is the fact that I live in the Twin Cities metro. I don't live on the family farm. I'm an attorney in Minneapolis. My business isn't drawn from My clientele isn't drawn from southern Minnesota, and so I'm in a unique position to speak out. And you know what I would tell people is, you have a voice, use it.
For more on Dodge County Incorporated and LSP's November 4th, 2025 panel discussion on agricultural consolidation, see the podcast page for Ear to the Ground episode 383 at landstewardshipproject.org. As I mentioned before, episode 384 of Ear to the Ground will feature a conversation with Austin Frerick, author of Barons, Money, Power, and the Corruption of America's Food Industry. If you have comments or suggestions about this podcast, contact Brian DeVore at bdevore@landstewardshipproject.org, or you can call 612-816-9342. By the way, it helps us greatly if you can give Ear to the Ground a rating on whatever podcast platform you utilize. And word of mouth is the best way to spread the news about our podcast. If you like what you hear, tell at least one person about LSP's Ear to the Ground. Thanks to Laura Borgendale, Western Minnesota musician, for Ear to the Ground's theme music. And a special thank you to all of Land Stewardship Project's members who make initiatives such as this podcast possible. If you're not a member, visit landstewardshipproject.org to learn how you can support LSP. Thanks for listening.